and the woman who would be soon. He opened the back door and lifted her out, sensing the body bag move slightly and hearing a drugged moan from inside it. He became fully aroused now that he was feeling safe and anticipating what he would do to the woman, and carried her to the crypt he had chosen for her final resting place. "Damn, he's big," Detective John Phillips thought to himself as he watched from his hiding place about 50 yards away up on the crest of the hill. John realized that Roonan might be too big for him to take by himself, but he couldn't call for backup even if he wanted to. He had left his cell and radio at home, for several reasons. He didn't want his superiors to have any possible way of tracking him down and putting a stop to this uncondoned investigation, and he worried that the killer might be sophisticated enough to be using some kind of an electronics detector. He also had to admit that he wanted to take this scumbag down all by himself, because of his competitive nature and the fact that no one on the force had taken his theories seriously. Even his partner had been unwilling to join him on this out-of-jurisdiction stakeout, saying, "I'm not getting fired or freezing my balls off for one of your fucking hunches." Which was probably good in the end, because this would have been harder with two people. John had walked into the cemetery a day earlier during a time when there were other visitors, and lay down at this spot to test his hunch by seeing if the full moon goon happened to bring his victims here. His investigation had started with the disappearance of a woman from his rural hometown who had been partying in the city, and some rather thin clues had led him to this cemetery employee and a macabre notion of what he might be doing with the bodies. John wanted to check it out during the full moon night, but knew that the perp might have a way to make sure no one entered the cemetery in the hours prior. So to be safe, he had to find a good hiding spot and stay there as long as needed. And this spot was ideal for several reasons. One was that it was a square family plot set apart from the other graves by a wrought iron fence that sat on a low brick wall, so no one would be walking through it, and no one on the outside could see John when he lay prone next to the interior of the brick wall. But when he poked his head over it, he could see the entire northwest section of the cemetery, because the plot was on the top of the hill above it. He could also see two terraced rows of crypts almost as high as him to the right, in case Roonan might use one of them, and he could see a long row of crypts to the left that were built into the bottom of the hillside, next to where the black van was now parked. John had guessed this particular part of the huge cemetery because the hill and river made it very private, and the guess had paid off. The only problem with his plan was that it was very cold, lying in the snow, and Roonan hadn't come during the middle of the night, as he'd suspected, but in the early morning, when his shift started. So John was already suffering symptoms of hypothermia by the time he pushed himself up and out of his hiding place to head down the hill. His body shivered, his heart and lungs raced, and the hand that gripped his gun was numb enough that he dropped it once during his descent. He also felt lightheaded by the time he reached the van and pulled the keys out of the ignition, throwing them into the snow far away from the vehicle. Then he turned to gaze at the long row of crypts nearby, and was no longer entirely sure which one he had seen Roonan enter. But when he trusted his first instinct and pulled on one of the big iron doors, it was indeed unlocked and swung open. It took so much effort for John to move it, in his weakened state, that he briefly questioned whether or not he should enter and confront the big psycho. It also didn't help that opening the door made a lot of noise, so Roonan probably knew he was coming. John started down the steps with his gun and small flashlight extended, but when he reached the burial chamber at the bottom of the stairs, all he could see was the bound victim lying on her back in the middle of the cement floor. Half her clothes had been cut off, several small wounds had been inflicted on her exposed skin, and beside her lay a set of sinister-looking knives. As John knelt down beside the woman to check her pulse, he pointed the weak beam from the little flashlight toward